Right now, as you watch this, 20 minutes from the American blockade line in the Strait of Hormuz, a tanker called Rich Starry is making its move. No warning, no radio contact, no request for permission. The vessel simply adjusts its course, increases speed, and drives straight toward the U.S. Navy's enforcement corridor, as if the blockade does not exist. On the bridge of an American warship, every screen lights up at once. And in the next few minutes, what happens on that water sends a message that travels from Washington to Beijing to Tehran at the speed of satellite data. It is not about what the tanker is carrying. It is not about where it is going. It is about who sent it. Because Rich Starry is a Chinese-linked vessel. And for the first time in decades, the gap between what Beijing says it can do and what Beijing can actually do is about to be exposed in public, in real time, on the most watched waterway on Earth. 3 tankers approach, 3 tankers turn back. Not a shot is fired. And the era in which China could bluff its way through American red lines with strong words and state television is dead. Stay with Dr. Elena Harris, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz is not just an Iran story. It is the story of the real limits of Chinese power. And those limits are being drawn on open water by the hour, with new developments coming in every few minutes. To understand why a tanker turning back matters as much as it does, you first need to understand what Beijing and Tehran spent the last 15 years building together. Because the American blockade did not just cut off Iranian oil exports. It severed a strategic architecture that both capitals had constructed piece by piece, and that China had come to depend on in ways that went far beyond the price of crude. China is Iran's largest trade partner. By a wide margin, its most important oil customer. But the relationship runs deeper than barrels per day. Iran gave China something no other Middle Eastern state would give, a geographic foothold inside the region that bypassed American influence entirely. That foothold had a name. The Port of Chabahar, anchored inside Belt and Road infrastructure investments that, as Bloomberg has documented, run into the tens of billions of dollars over the past decade. In exchange, Beijing gave Tehran something the Islamic Republic could not survive without: technology, civilian infrastructure, diplomatic cover through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and, most critically, a shadow fleet of tankers that moved sanctioned Iranian crude to Chinese refineries in defiance of Western sanctions, keeping the regime economically functional through successive maximum pressure campaigns that would otherwise have strangled it. This was a system, a pipeline of oil, money, and strategic protection flowing between 2 capitals, operating outside the frameworks Washington controlled. Iran needed Chinese demand to survive. China needed Iranian oil to stay cheap and its Middle Eastern foothold to stay relevant. And then, on April 13, 2026, the United States Navy shut the entire system down in a single morning. Kharg Island, through which roughly 90% of Iranian crude flows, locked. Chabahar, China's carefully cultivated alternative gateway, locked. Bandar Abbas, the entry and exit point for virtually everything moving in and out of Iran by sea, locked. Every channel Beijing used to purchase sanctioned Iranian oil, sealed at the same hour. Now, let us talk about what that morning actually did to the Chinese position. Because the Belt and Road's Iranian leg did not get slower. It became operationally useless overnight. Billions of dollars in Chinese infrastructure investment stranded. The diplomatic shield Beijing had provided Tehran rendered irrelevant because the problem was no longer being solved through diplomacy. It was being solved through 3 carrier strike groups and 15 warships backed by continuous air patrols and submarine coverage that the People's Liberation Army Navy had no way to contest in that geography. 190 million barrels of Iranian oil, already loaded, already at sea, with nowhere to go. The strategic bridge built over more than a decade, cut in a single morning. And even that was not the moment that truly revealed the depth of China's problem. That moment came when Beijing decided to test whether the blockade was real. According to Reuters ship tracking data, the tanker Rich Starry approached the enforcement corridor and made its move. Within 20 minutes, it executed a U-turn. Two more tankers, one named Austria, at least one other, repeated the same maneuver in rapid succession. Three Chinese-linked vessels turned back before reaching their destination. Without a shot fired, without a confrontation, without a standoff, just a turn, and a message received. Chinese Defense Minister Admiral Dong Jun stepped to a podium in Beijing and issued words that were designed to sound like power. He said Chinese ships had passed through Hormuz. He said China had agreements with Iran. He said the United States should not interfere in Chinese affairs. Strong words, commanding words, words broadcast across every state media outlet in the country and circulated through diplomatic channels worldwide. And yet, not a single ship was protected by those words. Not one tanker moved through the corridor that Dong Jun implied Beijing had the right and the will to defend. The gap between the statement and the reality was visible to every navy, every intelligence service, every government watching this crisis unfold. Let that sink in. Here is what that actually means for Beijing. China's problem is not just about the loss of Iranian oil. That alone is manageable, at least in the short term. China holds approximately 130 days of strategic petroleum reserves. It can draw down. It can find alternative suppliers at higher prices. It can absorb the immediate disruption painfully, but functionally. The real problem is Hormuz itself, and the numbers explain exactly why. China imports over 10 million barrels of oil every single day, almost entirely by sea. That is according to Bloomberg energy data. Roughly 40% of that supply transits the Strait of Hormuz, not just from Iran, from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, from the UAE, from Kuwait, from Qatar. Add it all together and approximately half of China's total seaborne oil supply depends on that one waterway operating freely. Half. Let that number settle for a moment. Half of the seaborne oil feeding the world's second-largest economy passes through a choke point the United States Navy now controls with 3 carrier strike groups. As long as the U.S. Navy controls that strait, China's energy security is, in a very direct and immediate sense, at the mercy of American decisions. That is not an acceptable strategic reality for a country that has spent 2 decades projecting itself as a rising global power capable of operating independently of American-dominated systems. It is not acceptable for an economy whose industrial base, manufacturing capacity, and political stability all depend on affordable and reliable energy. And it is not acceptable for a communist party whose domestic legitimacy rests on delivering continuous economic growth to 1.4 billion people who have been told, for a generation, that their country is becoming a superpower. This is why Rich Starry's U-turn carries weight far beyond the oil it was carrying. This is the moment China's claim to peer competitor status with the United States was tested in the real world on open water and came up short. So, what does Beijing do now? This is where the crisis enters its most dangerous phase, because China has options, and none of them are good. Option 1. Direct military confrontation. Can the People's Liberation Army Navy send warships to Hormuz to break the blockade by force? In theory, yes. China maintains an overseas military base in Djibouti. Its naval expansion over the past decade, as the Wall Street Journal has documented, has been historic in scope. But Hormuz is a completely different strategic environment from anything the PLA Navy has ever tested itself in. Against the force currently assembled there, the math is brutal. 3 carrier strike groups anchored by the USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS Gerald R. Ford, and the USS George H.W. Bush. Over 15 surface combatants, F-35C and F-A-18 fighters flying continuous combat air patrols. P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft sweeping every inch of the surface. Submarines operating below. More than 50,000 American military personnel in theater. No Chinese force can match it on that water. And a Chinese warship forcing the blockade line means direct military confrontation between 2 nuclear powers at sea. The last time the world experienced something remotely like this dynamic was October 1962, when Soviet cargo ships approached a U.S. naval blockade line around Cuba. That crisis is remembered as the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War are using that comparison deliberately. China is not in a position to risk that confrontation, not with Taiwan tensions already elevated, not with its economy already absorbing damage from American tariffs, not in a theater where American military superiority is overwhelming and unambiguous. Option 2. The gray zone. What Beijing has mastered in the South China Sea. Coast Guard vessels instead of warships. Fishing militia boats instead of military assets. Presence without triggering the threshold for open military confrontation. Beijing could attempt to send commercial tankers with Coast Guard escort, a quasi-military convoy designed to deter rather than fight. But here is the part that changes everything. That tactic works when you are facing the Philippine Coast Guard. It works when you are facing Vietnamese patrol boats. It does not work when you are facing 3 American carrier strike groups. If China sends a gray zone convoy and the United States stops it, Beijing's bluff is called in front of the entire world. The multipolar order narrative that China has been constructing for a decade collapses in a single incident. Option 3. The arena Beijing knows best. Diplomatic and economic pressure. China holds a permanent UN Security Council veto. It can block any resolution that would legitimize the blockade. It can escalate the trade war, sell U.S. Treasury holdings, weaponize the supply chains where China's market dominance gives it genuine leverage. But none of those tools opens the strait. Diplomatic maneuvers operate on timelines measured in months and years. Chinese refineries operate on timelines measured in days and weeks. The veto at Turtle Bay does not put oil in a tanker. Make sure you are subscribed to Dr. Elena Harris because what comes next reveals the one option Beijing is actually executing right now, the quiet move that is reshaping energy flows across Asia, and why Washington's blockade may not be as airtight as the Pentagon is telling you. Hit that subscribe button right now. Option 4 is what Beijing is actually doing. Waiting, calculating, absorbing damage while attempting to make others absorb more. China has already halted gasoline and diesel exports, squeezing Japan and South Korea and weakening regional rivals who depend on Chinese fuel re-exports. It has begun purchasing American LNG, reopening imports it had suspended during the trade war, attempting to create diplomatic leverage through economic engagement, even as the military confrontation intensifies. It is positioning itself as the indispensable fuel supplier to Southeast Asian nations, scrambling for alternatives, expanding regional influence even as its own energy situation deteriorates. China is hurting. China is calculating. China is ensuring, as best it can, that its rivals hurt more. And Beijing has concluded, at least for now, that patience is safer than escalation. Option 5. The long game. Building alternatives to Hormuz entirely. Beijing has invested for years in infrastructure that bypasses the strait, most notably the China-Pakistan economic corridor running through Bandar Port, which could, in theory, move Gulf oil into Western China overland without ever passing through Hormuz. The crisis has proven beyond any doubt the strategic value of those investments, but those corridors cannot yet match Hormuz's capacity. Not close. They are a decade-long solution to a 2-week emergency. They do not help Chinese refineries that need oil now. Now here is the dimension of this story that most Western coverage is not paying enough attention to. The American side of the equation has its own limits, and understanding those limits is essential to understanding how this ends. Keeping 3 carrier strike groups deployed indefinitely to a single theater is logistically punishing. Aircraft carriers require constant maintenance cycles. Personnel rotation schedules constrain sustained operations. Ammunition resupply, fuel logistics, and the support chain for a force of this size are substantial ongoing operations in themselves. And crucially, every asset concentrated in Hormuz is an asset that cannot simultaneously be present in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, or the Baltic Sea, where other potential flashpoints are watching this crisis with intense interest. Allied support has also been far more limited than Washington projected. The UAE and Bahrain have announced support for the blockade. The United Kingdom, as CBS News has reported, stated explicitly that it would not join the blockade operation, focusing instead on mine clearing and humanitarian navigation assurance. Germany declined to participate. Australia declined to participate. France is conducting its own independent navigation mission with the UK, explicitly separate from the American enforcement operation. The United States is running the most consequential naval operation of the 21st century largely alone, and the blockade itself, while operationally effective, is not airtight. According to Lloyd's List Intelligence, ship tracking data confirms that at least 7 Iran-linked vessels have transited the strait since enforcement began. 3 of them were under active American sanctions. The Pentagon appears to be making calculated decisions about which vessels to intercept and which to allow through. A selectivity that reveals both the practical limits of enforcing a blockade across one of the busiest maritime corridors on Earth, and the political calculations running beneath every enforcement decision. Rich Starry itself returned on its first approach. It transited on its second attempt. The blockade is real. The blockade is working. But the blockade is not absolute. And that gap between official policy and operational reality is where China is testing, probing, and pushing every single day. Let us bring all of these threads together and be precise about what this moment actually is. Iran's position has undergone a transformation so complete it would have been unimaginable 2 months ago. For decades, Iranian military doctrine rested on a single strategic pillar: the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz. That threat made Iran untouchable. It deterred military action. It gave Tehran leverage over every economy on the planet. Hormuz was Iran's weapon, its deterrent, its insurance policy against the overwhelming conventional power arrayed against it. Since Operation Epic Fury began, that leverage has been stripped away systematically. Iran's air defense collapsed within weeks. Over 100 coalition aircraft entered Iranian airspace, struck central Tehran, and returned without loss. Underground facilities described as impenetrable were penetrated by B-2 bombers carrying bunker-busting munitions. The Bushehr naval base was leveled. The IRGC command chain was shattered. Intelligence chiefs and operations commanders were killed. The logistics hub at Imam Ali was struck. Supply chains to Hezbollah and the Houthis were disrupted. Iran closed Hormuz. Iran sent oil prices surging past $150. Iran triggered fuel crises across Europe, genuine economic pain across Asia, paralyzed global shipping, and proved that its ultimate deterrent was real. And then America answered, not by reopening the strait and restoring the previous status quo, by taking the strait away from Iran entirely, clearing the mines systematically, establishing a safe corridor, opening it to world trade, and simultaneously locking every Iranian port behind a blockade that stops the oil from leaving while letting everything else flow. The strait is open for everyone except Iran. Iran wanted to punish the world by closing Hormuz. America's answer was elegant. America's answer was devastating. We are opening it. But you are staying locked inside. Iran's own weapon turned against it. Iran's own logic reversed, used with superior force against the country that invented the tactic. And now we arrive at the scenario that has analysts at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists losing sleep. The question is whether the diplomatic window closes before the oil storage clock runs out. Because the clock is running. The $13 billion monthly revenue loss is accumulating. The well-shut-down timeline is approaching. And the domestic economic crisis that had already brought Iranians into the streets in numbers that nearly toppled the regime is about to get catastrophically worse. 3 futures are now in play. Future 1. Diplomacy. Iran returns to the negotiating table with a counter-proposal built on the framework presented in Islamabad. Beijing's quiet pressure on Tehran, pressure China cannot publicly acknowledge but is intensifying by the day as its own energy security deteriorates, tips the calculation toward a deal. The blockade is lifted, a framework is signed. The strait returns to normal operation under international oversight. Future 2. Escalation. Iran activates the Houthis. The Bab el-Mandeb, the second most strategically important waterway on Earth, is disrupted simultaneously. A Chinese convoy tests the blockade with quasi-military escort and creates a confrontation that neither Beijing nor Washington fully controls. The ceasefire collapses. Oil prices breach levels that trigger a genuine global recession. The conflict expands beyond the boundaries any party originally intended. Future 3. Prolonged standoff. The blockade holds but does not force Iran to the table quickly enough. American logistical sustainability comes under question. Allied support fails to materialize. China continues probing with sanctioned tankers. Some get through. Tehran's runway slightly extends. The crisis grinds forward without resolution, restructuring global energy markets around alternatives to Hormuz that take years to build, and leaving a region permanently scarred by a confrontation nobody could find the exit from. Will Tehran accept the framework before the storage fills? Will Beijing keep holding back from the line? Or will a single sanctioned convoy force the confrontation everyone is trying to avoid? Will the Cuban Missile Crisis comparison hold, with one side blinking in 13 days, or does this one grind into 13 months? The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 lasted 13 days. It ended because one side blinked. Because someone in Moscow looked at the American blockade line, looked at the military reality of what lay beyond it, and made the calculation that the cost of pushing through exceeded anything that could be gained. In 2026, the same equation is playing out in a different strait with different actors and different weapons. But the core logic is identical. This is a hinge point. A before and after that will define the next generation of naval strategy, energy policy, and the real architecture of the 21st century global order. China's tankers turned back. China's defense minister issued strong words that could not protect a single ship. Beijing calculates. Beijing does not take risks. And that deliberate choice to hold back from the line may be the single most important strategic revelation in a decade of rising Sino-American tension. Rich Starry turned back 20 minutes from the corridor. And in those 20 minutes, the world learned exactly where the real distance between American power and Chinese power now lies. Hormuz is no longer Iran's weapon. Hormuz is now Iran's cage, and the world is holding its breath, watching the water, waiting to see who blinks first. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single update as this confrontation evolves. The tankers, the carrier movements, the diplomatic back channels, the enforcement decisions. They are changing by the hour, and the analysis you are getting here is built to keep you ahead of the headlines, not behind them. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand that what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz is not a side story. It is the story that will define the next chapter of great power competition, American naval strategy, and the real limits of Chinese global reach. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Beijing will keep holding back from the blockade line and absorb the economic pain? Or do you think China will eventually send a convoy that forces a direct confrontation with the United States Navy? We will see you in the next one.